Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So I'll first of all introduce myself and talk a little bit about the Transparency Task Force, and then I'll be passing over to Nikhil, Rathi, the Chief Executive of the FCA, as soon as I can, so that Nikhil can quickly work his way through some thoughts about the FCA's transformation program, which of course is the topic for today. And then we'll move quickly into the Q&A session, which I know everybody's looking forward to. So what is the Transparency Task Force? We are a certified social enterprise. We became a certified social enterprise last year. And what that means is that we are constitutionally obliged to stick to our formal mission. And what is our formal mission? Our formal mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. So we're all about trying to make things better. We're all about trying to encourage reform of the system. In operational terms, the Transparency Task Force operate through 25 groups. They cover a broad range of topics, each one designed to deal with a particular part of the financial system. And there's one particular group that resonates very strongly with today's symposium, and that's the group that we call Regulators Watch. Just before I talk about that, let me just go back to here. Here's a saying from Margaret Mead, a very well-known person of thought leadership quality in relation to how to make the world a better place. Very famous Margaret Mead quotation: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And that idea, the idea that small groups of thoughtful, committed people working together to change the world, is an idea that really is at the very heart of what the Transparency Task Force is all about. So that's a philosophy that we hold very, very dearly to our hearts. The group that most relates to tonight's event is our Regulators Watch group, which you're now taking a look at. It's got quite a few people in it, and I'm just going to read out a part of this description of our Regulators Watch group, because that will hopefully set the tone and the feel for today's session. So just in case you can't read it yourselves, I'll read it out. It says, "Our Regulators Watch group is for those that want to scrutinise the activity and effectiveness of financial regulators, be they in the UK or elsewhere." I'll come back to the or elsewhere bit in just a moment. The Transparency Task Force is a critical friend to regulators. That's how we see ourselves. We see our value in helping to ensure that financial regulators are aware of what more they could be doing to help protect the interests of consumers. We have always enjoyed a highly engaged working relationship with regulators. We see ourselves as being on their side, although it may not always seem that way to them, always thinking about what more can be done to become as effective as possible. If ever we feel there is a need to be critical, we will be critical, but in a constructive way. When we identify what we see as shortcomings, we will always seek to offer pragmatic solutions as well. We sincerely hope that our critical friend positioning with regulators will be welcomed by all that are keen to receive constructive, well-intended feedback. And really, that's essentially what today's symposium is all about. It's an opportunity for us to engage with the regulator, in today's case with the Chief Executive of the FCA, Nikhil Rathi, and have an opportunity for candid, constructive, but always civilized discussion and debate around the issues. We are very much a solution-orientated organization. We are not simply about trying to identify the faults without offering solutions. We're about trying to say, this isn't working, that's not working, why don't we do this? What about that? And of course, when necessary, we don't hesitate to call out what we see as underperformance by regulators, whether they be in the UK or overseas. So I'm looking forward to what I know will be a very constructive, candid, but always civilized discussion today. I'm also going to briefly show you our ambassadors web page. And our ambassadors web page is significant because one of the things that makes the Transparency Task Force relatively unusual is our international dimension. We have over 400 ambassadors of the Transparency Task Force from around 21 countries. These are the countries where we are represented. And the 400 or so ambassadors represent roughly 10% of our total community. We have a community of about 4,000 people around the world. And what that gives us is a pretty unique international perspective of issues. We are always actively drawing upon that international perspective to understand what's happening in different parts of the world, always looking for best practice, what is happening in Canada that could be happening in the UK that's not, what's happening in the USA or Australia that could be happening in the UK that's not. And through our membership, in particular our ambassadors, and sometimes our speakers, we're able to find ideas that really would work very well in one part of the world as well as another. So I hope that sets the scene very, very nicely for everybody. We are, of course, going to manage proceedings very tightly tonight. This is the first time we've ever had the opportunity of having the Chief Executive of the Financial Conduct Authority with us. And regardless of what you think about the FCA, I repeat, regardless of what you think about the FCA, tonight's session is all about understanding what's happened in the past and thinking about what can we do to make the future better as a direct consequence of understanding what has happened in the past. Let's remain civilized. Let's remain very solution orientated. The very, very good news, is that we've been absolutely swamped. I really do mean absolutely swamped with suggested questions. And frankly, there's no chance of us getting through all of the questions that have been submitted for consideration. The good news is also that we are not that far away from the next annual public meeting of the FCA. I will circulate a link to this webpage as well as the others I've shown you when we circulate the notes from today's session sometime tomorrow morning. So the annual public meeting of the FCA is on Tuesday, 28th of September. This year it's online for pretty obvious reasons, 10 o'clock UK time. And you do have the opportunity to submit questions. No idea whether your question would or wouldn't be selected, but you do have the opportunity to submit questions. And I think, Nikhil will tell me if I'm wrong, I think the FCA commits to responding to all of them, whether in writing or on the day. Okay, in terms of helping to further set the scene about tonight's event, I'm going to briefly talk about Violation Tracker. And if I can just again remind everybody to please put yourselves on mute. Violation Tracker, wrong wording, Violation Tracker. Violation Tracker, if you don't know, is a very powerful US database. Again, I'll provide a link to this. As its name suggests, what it does is it tracks violations. And through this database, we can get some really good insights into some incredibly important matters. The one aspect of this database, which I'm going to share with you right now, relates to the ranking of all the different industries. So if we click here on the industry totals, it gives us a listing of the 50 or so industries ranked by how bad they are in terms of how large the fines are that they've received. The data in this database goes all the way back to the year 2000. So there's 20 years of data in this database, which is in itself quite remarkable. I'll also make the obvious point. Financial services is not where it really should be. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, as I've argued many times before, that the financial services industry really does need to be trusted to function successfully. The word credit comes from the Latin word credere, which means believe in. And if you think about it, our entire financial ecosystem is built on the idea that it can be believed in. So when we see data like this showing that the financial services sector is the worst performing industry of all, not the best performing, but the worst performing industry of all in terms of fines against it, it really does make you wonder what on earth is going on. And by the way, not only is it the worst performing industry of all, It's the worst performing industry by a long, long way. Here's financial services at number one, with a total fine count of 332,924,888,663. And number two position is taken up by the pharmaceuticals industry, and they're no angels. Number three is oil and gas, no angels either, when you take into account all those oil spillages, etc., etc. In actual fact, if you add up all of the fines of all of these industries, they roughly equate to the total, the sum total of the financial services industry. And the reason I make this point is very simply this. It would appear as though there is something systemically wrong with the conduct within the financial services industry. I'm not talking about the UK here specifically or about the USA. I'm making very, very general comments. And when you click down to the next level of detail, you get a ranking of the worst 10 offenders. None of us are proud that NatWest Group PLC makes it into the top 10 of the US orientated database. None of us are proud of that, of course. But when you scroll down, what you also get are the worst offending cases by size. And you very quickly see a pattern. The pattern is this: the same organizations and the same kinds of organizations are being caught doing something wrong. They get fined for doing it, and they do it again, and they do it again. And this makes us wonder whether the regulatory framework around the financial industry is effective. And I make that point, not to make a cheap comment, but simply to point out this stark reality, that if the main purpose of the regulatory framework is to create a safe, steady, trustworthy marketplace, it would suggest that perhaps that's not happening right now. And perhaps, therefore, things need to change. Some would even argue that the financial regulatory framework is broken. In fact, we had a symposium last night about that very, very topic. We had an event all about the idea that the financial regulatory framework is failing and what needs to be done about it. It was a particularly interesting session. So here we are with a chance to hear directly from the Chief Executive of the FCA, which I'm very, very appreciative of. Thank you very much, FCA. Thank you very much indeed, Nikhil, Rathi, for coming tonight to talk to us all. The theme, as you all know, is the FCA's transformation program and beyond. And that really does set the scene nicely, not just to talk about why there's a transformation program, what's wrong that needs sorting, but also to talk about the future. So in just a few seconds, I'll pass over to Nikhil to pick up from here. I want to express my appreciation to Nikhil for agreeing to come tonight. We had a conversation, many, many months ago, and the conclusion from that conversation was that it would be a good idea for the Chief Executive to come to the Transparency Task Force, talk to us in a kind of open and candid way about the issues as he sees them. And I'm very, very, very glad that he has, because, of course, it would have been a lot easier for him to not spend his Thursday night coming to talk to us lot. He could have been doing many, many other things as well. So we're very grateful to that. As a mark of appreciation, can I please invite everybody to put your hands together and thank Nikhil for coming out tonight and spending some time with us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Nikhil, over to you. I know there's a lot to talk through. We've got loads and loads of questions. So if you'd like to get through your notes about what you'd like to say as quickly as you'd like to, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A bit after that. Nikhil, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening, Andy, and to everyone who's joined. And good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I don't think I've ever been applauded on arrival, actually, into a virtual room. That was really very kind of you. And thank you for the way in which you opened and your willingness to approach this conversation as a critical friend of the FCA. I think it's always important for us to hear a range of voices. I hear what you say, that you have lots of questions, so I won't overdo it at the start. I'll just give you a quick canter through a few thoughts, and then I will turn over to you for questions. I'm also joined this evening by my colleague Sheldon Mills, who's Executive Director for Consumers and Competition, and also Ian Searle, who's our Head of Department for Consumer Duty and Online Harms in our Consumer Division. So I'm sure you'll want to hear from them as well at some point. So for me, it's nearly coming up to a year since I joined the FCA, and I joined it remotely at quite a extraordinary time, really. In October last year, we were going into another round of lockdowns, preparing for the end of the transition period, or when the UK, after the UK had left the European Union. A lot of historical issues in relation to the FCA, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on, coming to a conclusion, and technological change as well, having a big impact on our work. So it really has been quite an extraordinary year for everyone, and you'll know some of the statistics as much as I do. 5 million payment deferrals following action from the FCA, business interruption insurance, which the case started before I arrived, which the day after I arrived went onto the Supreme Court, now delivered nearly $750 million insurance payments for small businesses that were affected by the pandemic. We know that the pandemic has impacted vulnerable customers. The scale of vulnerability increased by approximately 3.7 million people in the UK during the pandemic, and that's going to be a really big issue for us going forward. The levels of financial resilience are a level of concern. We also have a significant markets responsibility, keeping markets functioning during the pandemic and beyond. It's been heartening to see that very significant levels of capital have been raised to support the return to growth in the economy, and that's an important dimension of the work we do. We've been supportive of new and innovative technologies through our regulatory sandbox, but also keeping an eye on the systems and controls that are needed, particularly around financial crime, anti-money laundering, and so on. You're quite right that in the past there have been challenges also, and I've been quite open since I've arrived that there are many things that we need to learn from experiences in the past. Criticism inherited not just in relation to cases from the previous FSA, but also more recently, and there have been independent investigations which we have engaged with and responded to. So as a leadership team, there's been significant change in our leadership team over the last year, not under any illusions about the work we have to do to build the operational foundations of our organisation, but also adjust culturally for the future as well. The FCA is never going to be a zero-fail regulator. It's not realistic with the 60,000 firms that we authorise and supervise. But we must be a learning organisation which adapts and addresses the challenges ahead of us. Our perimeter expands over time, as you know. So we are bringing funeral plans into regulation. We are awaiting the government's decisions on buy now, pay later, a very significant industry where my immediate predecessor, Chris Willard, did a review about the importance of bringing aspects of that industry into regulation as well. We have a huge agenda on the digital front. Interestingly, the firm I've met most since I've arrived in post is Google. We have to work very closely to deal with the scale of online harm that we see and the way in which that's reaching consumers, particularly vulnerable consumers. Scams, major source of concern for us. That's one of the reasons why a big part of our agenda going forward in relation to transformation is investing in our digital and data infrastructure. So we've committed to at least 120 million over 3 years to build those foundations to enable us to be more agile, to be more proactive, to address some of these harms, and particularly the harms that are occurring in new ways in the future. We'd expect also over time, and there will be issues we need to work through, to be using more advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning to help us navigate some of those harms. We expect for now big tech also to increasingly play a part in financial services. The products they offer have gone from 7 broad mainstream financial services products a few years ago to 43 in 2019. They're increasingly systemically important nodes of resilience, given the increasing move to cloud, and the growth of fintech firms, is there for all to see. So this is going to be a big feature also of our work going forward, and we as a regulator need to get ahead of that. You'll be starting to see, and you already are seeing, that as well as our traditional cooperative relationships with our financial supervisory partners in the UK and around the world, we are also now a member of the Digital Regulators Forum within the UK, looking to forge new ways in which we can work with big tech. I set out in July our business plan, and there was a speech accompanying that, and I said, look, I wanted us to be more innovative, more adaptive, more assertive. Wanted us to test our powers to the limit, and I recognise that we will need to be more willing to take legal risk. It's not always going to go our way, and that's some of the change that we have now started to implement. We're consulting on some of the changes to our decision-making procedures. That consultation closes tomorrow. We'll review the feedback from that, and hope to make some changes by November on top of some decisions we've already made in terms of changes to procedures to enable us to act more quickly, more decisively than we may have been able to in the past, while always respecting the important safeguards around procedural fairness. We know that there's been issues historically in how we've authorised firms, and risks at the gateway can be challenging for us. And if you get it wrong at the gateway when you authorise, that can cause all kinds of problems downstream. And we've invested further in our gateway. We're putting more people in there this year, and also investing in the operational infrastructure around that. There will be a regulatory nursery that we're developing to provide a greater umbrella around immediately authorised firms immediately after authorisation as well. The other points which I do think are important, and sometimes people have queried why I've spoken about these issues since I've landed, but I do think they're important for a regulator like us and our industry. I mean, to go to some of the points that you covered in your introduction, Andy. So I've talked about diversity and inclusion in our organisation, both as a regulator, leading by example, wanting to have an open culture, also being able to attract the best talent from all backgrounds, social and other backgrounds, but also the role we need to play in sponsoring that agenda in the financial services industry more broadly. And we're working with our colleagues at the Bank of England on that through a discussion paper. We do see this as relevant to our regulatory objectives. We do see this as relevant to the scale of conduct risk in firms, and we do expect boards now increasingly to be focused on it. And in general, a number of boards are engaging in it, in this agenda, and recognise the value to their firms around this. We've been making progress, but we've got our further to go ourselves. Finally, I'll just touch on the accountability dimension. So there's an active debate going on around the future regulatory framework. There's going to be big changes over time as the UK has left the European Union and the acquis moves back on shore, and there's a live debate in Parliament around this. You'll have seen the Treasury Committee's engagement on it. We entirely recognise that an accountable regulator needs to be transparent, needs to show it's working, and very engaged with the parliamentary committees, who are obviously the primary mechanism of accountability. And we've also ventured to start putting out objectives and metrics which we want to test. I set out some in July, and just this week in our consumer investments paper, we've given some more to start to put some specifics around how we think we should be measured against our regulatory outcomes. So those are sort of some headline thoughts. I'm really happy to engage. There's lots more I could talk about in terms of net zero and various other things. I'm sure we'll get onto those in questions. But I just wonder whether, Andy, with your permission, I could just ask Sheldon to say a few words specifically around consumer investments, and my colleague Ian to fill you in on the consumer duty, which I know was a topic of interest for your members.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil, and thanks, Andy, for the warm welcome, and good to see everybody from the Transparency Task Force. I'm Sheldon Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Consumers and Competition at the FCA, and I've been in post since December 2020 formally, but I've been with the FCA now for a couple of years. As Nikhil mentioned, one component of our transformation agenda is to make sure that we're much clearer on the outcomes we're seeking to achieve in particular markets. And one of those markets is the consumer investments markets. And we have seen in consumer investments an increase in scams, an increase in fraud, an increase in people engaging in higher risk investments. And we've seen some of the consequences of that. We want to tackle that. We don't think some of the rates of that occurrence are acceptable. And we do think it's appropriate for a regulator to be conscious and proactive in tackling some of those issues. So we've been working on our consumer investment strategy, which we have issued in the past 24, 48 hours. And I just set out some of the major targets that we've set ourselves for to reach by 2025. So it's a 3-year program. We'll seek to reduce by 20% the number of consumers who could benefit from investment earnings but are missing out. So effectively, there's about, our evidence shows there's around nearly 8.6 million consumers holding more than £10,000 worth of investable assets in cash. That money could be deployed into investments, which certainly could help them, also can help build and level up, build back better and help the economy. So that money can help fund investments in the economy. And one of the issues around that, some people are holding that cash for particular purposes. Others don't have the trust and confidence or the way in which that they can invest that money. So there's something about getting people in investing. We also want to reduce the money that consumers lose to investment scams, which are perpetrated or facilitated by regulated firms in particular. Consumers lost nearly £570 million to investment fraud in 2021. That's tripled since 2018. We're honest and open about that evidence. And I think probably there is more harm as well there that we don't see by unregulated firms. And we want to reduce that. So we'll be working in relation to that. That's a wide range of activity. One is supporting people to understand when they might see fraud, see scams, or be able to protect themselves, but also us taking assertive action, both with regulated firms and also regulated firms who might be connected to unregulated activity, to seek to stop that in its tracks, being much more assertive at the gateway, who we authorize, and also being much more assertive with the firms that we regulate. And we can go into how our transformation program will help getting predictive data, training our people to get us on top of that, and how we can meaningfully report on that as we go through it. And then I suppose the other component is halving, making sure that consumers, look, people are free to invest where they wish to do so. But we want to be able to educate people and allow people to have the right sort of information, both from us, but also from the firm, so it's clear that they know when they're investing in higher risk products and they understand the risks around that. And we think that's important, both that education and the ability, making sure that firms are transparent and ensuring that they are providing the right sorts of information in relation to the products that they're supplying. There's lots of other bits and pieces in that strategy, which is out there, it's public on our website, and we're very happy to take feedback in relation to it. I'm going to pass over briefly to Ian, who's going to talk a little bit about our other important piece of work, which is the new consumer duty, which I know, Andy, you and the Transparency Task Force have views on as well. Ian.
Thank you. Ian, if I could ask you to be as concise as possible, because you've got quite a bit to get through. So please do share your thoughts, but be as concise as you can. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Andy. And evening, everyone. So as Andy said, my name's Ian Searle, and I'm the head of department responsible for the new consumer duty at the FCA. I'm pleased to have a chance to talk about it tonight. I'll just say briefly, as requested, Andy, what the NCD is and why it's needed. Before I get into that, I thought I would just quickly update you on what we've been doing and where things stand in the work. So as you know, we consulted in May on the overall structure and design of the duty. I'm pleased to say we had several hundred responses to that consultation, which reflects the interest that everyone rightly has in the topic, including from the task force and its members, and we've been busy analysing those. We'll be discussing it in more detail with Nikhil and Sheldon and the rest of our executive and board in coming weeks. We expect to publish a second consultation by the end of the year and any rules by end of July next year. So in terms of what the NCD is and why it's needed, it's worth saying we have always said, and we should be really clear, that we do see a range of good practice by firms in retail sectors, but we've also seen evidence of practices that cause harm, whether that's firms offering products that don't represent good value, or so-called sludge practices, or firms providing information which is misleading. And that comes through in our data, and only a third of respondents to our last Financial Lives survey agreed that firms are open and transparent in their dealings with them. Now, we've addressed those over time through our regulatory and supervisory tools, but we want a reset, and we want to see all firms getting it right in the first place. And this is really important in today's world, where consumers are making more decisions and where they're doing so in a complex and fast landscape. So we want to raise the standard of care that firms owe their retail customers above the level of our current principles. And in particular, we want a much greater emphasis on consumer outcomes. So we want to see firms putting themselves in the shoes of their customers, and we want to see them doing that throughout the whole customer journey. And in the interest of brevity, I won't go into too much detail. We've sought to use our package of requirements to deliver that. You know, a headline principle that sets out what we expect, cross-cutting rules that set out the behaviours we expect from firms, and a series of detailed outcome rules that specify the specific areas we're focused on. But happy to discuss that more in Q&A if that's helpful.
Ian, thank you very much indeed, and thanks all. Let's jump straight into the Q&A part of this. I've got a few questions of my own, and then we'll be passing on to other TTF colleagues. So after I've asked a few questions, just to let everybody know the running order, we're then going to go to questions from Mark Bishop, then Nigel Cairns. I'm just going to mute Mark Falcon's microphone. There we go. Yeah, we're going to have questions from myself, then Mark Bishop, then Nigel Cairns. After Nigel, we go to John Banerjee. Then we go to Ian Davis, Tony Heckles, Paul Carlier, and then we'll see where we get to after that. So, Nikhil, question number one for you is about consumer engagement. So, a lack of engagement with the FCA has been a real sense of frustration for us so far. We understand that there is an FCA consumer network. I believe it has about 31 or 32 different organisations within it. Very simple question. Would you welcome our pro-consumer voice amongst that consumer network? And if not, very simply, why not?
The consumer network, I think, is a wide range of charities and other groups involved on the ground, working frontline with consumers. I'm not particularly personally getting involved in the selection of membership. The team will deal with that, and of course they'll think hard about your interests. But you know, as you can see from today, happy to engage with you, and as we have been doing over several months. I mean, on the broad question of consumer engagement, obviously there's a whole range of actors in this area. We have a role to play. Obviously, the MAPS has a role to play as well. We do recognise there'll be areas where we need to do more, and the consumer investment strategy that Sheldon talked about just now, you'll see that we committed to £11 million of additional funding to communicate directly with consumers about high risk investments. But it's going to be one area where you will see us becoming more active, particularly in the digital space, working with other partners in the coming period. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikhil. So who do we speak to about applying to become part of the consumer network?
You can speak to me directly about that, Andy. That's absolutely fine. I mean, I think if underlying your question is that we don't hear from a wide range of consumers, I don't think that's validated. But I'm very happy to discuss with you or your colleagues as to what I hear might be a little bit of frustration as to the way in which we communicate or are open with people. I think we're a very open organisation. I'm very happy to discuss with you how it works. In terms of the consumer network, to give you a sense of what it is or does, it generally is actors who are, it's a wide range of actors who we bring together from time to time to discuss certain consumer issues. So we might be consulting on the new consumer duty. So the consumer network might meet to discuss that. But we also have different ways of meeting with people, either directly like this or in direct engagement. Our formal consumer input is evidently the statutory consumer panel. So the consumer network has no formal basis whatsoever. The consumer panel is the formal statutory body which oversees or we consult with, and access to join that is with the consumer panel chair. And I'm also very happy to put you in touch with her if they're looking for members for that as well.
Thank you, Sheldon. That would be nice. I've applied to join the consumer panel a couple of times. I haven't even got to interview stage, so hopefully we might do a bit better next time. Thank you very much, Sheldon. Thank you, Nikhil. The next question, I'm going to share my screen just to bring this question to life a little bit. So there are two all-party parliamentary groups that the Transparency Task Force is a secretariat for. One of them is the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services, as you can see. The other one, by the way, is on pension scams. Now, this APPG, the APPG on personal banking and fairer financial services, initiated a call for evidence about the FCA a couple of months ago. And the underlying purpose of this call for evidence is in line with what they call its purpose statement, which I'll just read out. The purpose statement is to identify aspects of personal banking and financial services where the service providers or regulators have not delivered or are not delivering excellence and appropriate consumer protection, etc. And it's worth noting that the chairman of the all-party parliamentary group, Peter Gibson MP, he says here that we believe this call for evidence about the FCA is an important initiative that will lead to a better understanding of the perceptions people have about our country's primary conduct regulator for financial services. We're very grateful for the input that will be provided by everybody that kindly steps forward to give their evidence, and we hope that it will lead to progressive policy thinking and meaningful reform for the benefit of all. And it's worth noting that this particular call for evidence includes the opportunity for FCA employees, past and present, to also contribute to the call for evidence. So the question for Nikhil is this: on the basis that the transformation program that you're leading is all about finding ways to run the FCA more effectively, and on the basis that this call for evidence is about finding ways to run the FCA more effectively, I take it you'd be supportive of the idea that FCA employees, past and present, could actually contribute to the call for evidence, and perhaps that you'd be happy to help promote it to your FCA staff so that they'd be happy to engage with it. Am I right in thinking you'd be happy to agree to both points?
Andy, thanks for flagging that. And I know the APPGs in a range of areas do a lot of really good work. But as we're going through our transformation, we're engaging obviously closely with our employees and hearing views. It's a really important part of our change agenda. We also have mechanisms where employees have concerns for them to raise them. I wouldn't actually actively encourage them to contribute in this way. We have mechanisms for parliamentary accountability. The Treasury Committee has just completed a fairly wide-ranging inquiry into the FCA. We have mechanisms, we've appeared before select committees. I've appeared several times since I've arrived. So you have to have an appropriate structure for that accountability to be channeled. I think any organisation would do that, but I certainly would want our employees to be sharing with us any concerns they have in a structured way. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Mark Bishop, then Nigel Cairns, then John Banerjee. Thank you. Mark Bishop, over to you. You're going to be asking a question about the FCA's exemption from civil liability and revisions to the complaint scheme. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Andy. The FCA is undergoing this transformation project because it has not always historically succeeded in performing its statutory duties to a reasonable standard. We know about the Connaught and LCF cases, and there are many others that have not yet been subject to independent reviews, but where many people believe the FCA is deserving of such scrutiny. Do you accept that there's a need, in fairness and in natural justice, for those who've suffered financial loss as a result of regulatory failure to be compensated for it? If so, would you back calls for the reversal of the FCA's broad exemption from civil liability and for the complaint scheme to be revised so it can explicitly be used as a conduit for the payment of redress in such cases? And in both instances, if not, why not?
Thanks, Mark. I mean, these were topics I think that were debated fairly extensively in Parliament when FSMA was passed, and the whole question around statutory immunity was discussed then. So how do you make sure you strike the right balance so that there is appropriate protection for consumers, but also that you don't create a system where the incentives on the regulator are such to go too far. And that was, if you go back to Hansard, there was extensive conversation in Parliament during the course of the passage of the legislation. So really, it would be for Parliament to adjust this, and they were clear the complaint scheme wasn't a conduit for compensation, although there's always the possibility of ex gratia payments. So I think what we'd say is that kind of shift that you're describing would be quite a fundamental shift to FSMA, and it will have societal and economic consequences as well. So I think it's really something I think for Parliament to consider in terms of the overall risk appetite that they have for the regulatory framework. But of course, we understand. I mean, particularly in recent cases, I entirely understand the thrust of your point, for example, in relation to LCF, and I think that's why you've seen the Treasury announce what they have announced in relation to that case as the appropriate mechanism for dealing with the issues that arose there, which are obviously very, very regrettable. And there is, of course, the FSCS, which is a statutory-based scheme, which has certain limitations around it as well, but it's also a feature of our framework. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Mark. We now go to Nigel Cairns, who has a question about competing objectives. Nigel.
Good evening to you, Nikhil, and to your colleagues as well. I'll read my question, if I may. Under statute, the FCA's operational consumer protection objective is secondary to the strategic objective of ensuring that the relevant markets work well. Do you agree that the competing but unequally prioritised objectives create an inherent conflict of responsibility which is impossible to fairly resolve? And how do you propose for your transformation programme to correct this imbalance?
Thank you. And that's the question. Obviously, Parliament sets our objectives, so I have no power to change what Parliament has determined and what Parliament's asked us to do. But I just sort of take a different view a little bit to how you've described the objectives. I mean, the making markets function well, that's a strategic objective. The consumer protection objective, plus the market integrity objective and competition in the interest of consumers are operational objectives. So I don't think that you could see them explicitly as secondary, one strategic and one set of operational objectives. We are clear that we have a clear consumer protection objective. You heard from Ian on how we think we need to evolve the way in which we have implemented that in our rule books through the consultation on the new consumer duty. We are explicitly asked, as you've seen, to weigh up different objectives in the work we do, and that's why we are cautious about a number of the debates that do take place from time to time about adding more objectives to the statutory list that's there, because I think that does then add a degree of complication. I think at the moment it's manageable, and it's really a question about how we interpret in our rule book as the system evolves. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Nigel. Let's go to John Banerjee, who has a question about the senior managers and certification regime. John.
Thank you very much indeed, Nikhil, and thank you, Andy. Mark Carney said in his Reith Memorial Lecture that the principal learning by regulators from the global financial crisis of 2008 was that more accountability for senior managers was required. This resulted in the senior manager and certification regime, which was brought into force in March 2016. Why has the FCA's press office not corrected its press release and the public perception that Jez Staley was sanctioned under the SM&CR rather than the existing code of conduct rules, as its enforcement notice shows? And why have there been 0 final enforcement notices for sanctions under the SMCR over 5.5 years after the inception of it?
Thanks. I'm not going to get into individual cases here. I mean, that's something that we discussed with Andy earlier, that we would avoid getting into individual cases. But I think the FCA and PRA statements in relation to the specific case you mentioned speak for themselves. You're quite right. The SMCR was an important feature of the post-financial crisis regime. It is something that I think is important, and that we have worked hard to embed across the financial system and apply to ourselves ourselves as well in an appropriate way, given that we're not a revenue generating organisation. We have a number of live investigations under the SMCR, and I hear the force of your point that now that it's been in place for a few years, that it's important that it is seen to have impact, and that will be something we're focused on going forward. What I do hear in terms of when we're engaging with firms is that the SMCR does have an impact in the way firms are thinking about accountability and responsibility, and has led to material changes. But obviously, it's something we need to keep a close eye on, John.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nikhil. Our next question is from Ian Davis. It's about authorisations. Ian.
Hello, Andy. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this meeting. And yes, I was wondering if you asked Nikhil, what measures, when the FCA regulates a company, what measures are taken to ensure that its directors have no past or present connections to fraud or criminal activity?
Yeah, but as part of the authorisation process, there's obviously checks around the status of those who are undertaking significant functions or have significant control over a firm. We also have a principle of transparency with the regulator, Principle 11 in particular, where we do expect firms to be very open with us about such situations, so they can be assessed properly. And there have been not too recent past cases at the tribunal where we have successfully defended those who have not been.
Thank you very much indeed for the reply, and thanks for the question, Ian. Next question is from Tony Heckles. It's going to be about an extension of the FCA principles. Tony Heckles, please. May need to come back to Tony by the looks of it. We're going to go straight to Paul Carlier. Paul Carlier's question is about whistleblowing. Paul Carlier, over to you.
Hi. The FCA transformation programme includes a new initiative on the treatment of whistleblowers and their evidence called In Confidence with Confidence. If a whistleblower employed by a firm escalates their disclosure to the FCA and also provides evidence to demonstrate that they have suffered detriment for having made the disclosure to their employer, will the FCA investigate both the disclosure itself and the firm's conduct in relation to the whistleblower and their evidence? And if the FCA does investigate the conduct towards the whistleblower, will it share its findings with him or her? And if not, why not?
Thanks, Paul. So the whistleblowing, clearly a very important part of the overall regulatory framework, and not just for financial services regulators. There's a framework across sectoral regulators as well. We launched a campaign in March, In Confidence with Confidence, and the objective of the campaign were to give reassurance to whistleblowers about how they could engage with the FCA, be clear about how they could do so, and have confidence in our processes and controls. And you'll know, and you'll have seen from the independent reviews, that not everything worked as well as it should have done in the past, and we want to make sure we learn from those experiences. And from what we've seen so far with the materials we've put on our website, there has been good and positive engagement with those materials. In terms of how we handle them, so we've got a specific whistleblowing team now that handles these cases. We we'll consider each case on its merits. We will consider how to respond. Sometimes some of the situations that are drawn to our attention are new. Sometimes there's existing supervisory work going on. And of course, if we have concerns around regulatory breaches, they will be assessed in the appropriate way. We do seek to, through a named contact in the whistleblowing team, maintain contact with whistleblowers. We also have restrictions under FSMA about how much confidential information about firms we can share. So sometimes that can place some guardrails around how much information we can provide in response to whistleblowers about exactly how their complaint has been dealt with. But we certainly aim to engage and give as much assurance as we can. I recognise that's not always going to be satisfactory for everyone who takes the difficult step of communicating with us.
Thank you. And next question is also about whistleblowing. It's from John Banerjee. So let's go back to John Banerjee. Your question on whistleblowing, please.
Hello, Nikhil. It's a very short question. Does the FCA consider unappealed employment tribunal judicial findings as conclusive evidence of the facts so found when the FCA is enforcing its SYSC 18 regulations regarding the safeguarding of whistleblowers?
Thanks, John. A second outing with your question, so good to hear from you again. As part of the investigation, our team will consider all evidence that it has in front of it, including judicial proceedings as part of the full gamut of evidence gathered in the case. Of course, each case has to be considered in its own merits, and we have to meet our own evidential threshold. So it's always going to be context.
Sorry, but just it's a very simple question. I mean, it's a yes or no. Do you per se consider employment tribunal findings that are unappealed as binding findings of fact if they're unappealed?
Yeah. So John, I think the tenor of your question, I think there's an individual case underpinning it that you're trying to.
No, it's a general question. It's
but what I'm saying is we will look at all of the facts in a context specific way. There isn't an automaticity as you're implying there.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I thank you for giving me that answer.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, John. We go back to Mark Bishop, who has a question about grasping the nettle. Mark Bishop.
Okay, thank you. So Martin Wheatley, Andrew Bailey, and now you, Nikhil, have come into office making a simple pitch, which in essence is, I inherited a failed organisation, I'm going to fix it. The fact that you yourself and Andrew Bailey were able to make the first part of this claim means that your respective predecessors failed to achieve the second part of it. They didn't completely fix it. How can you convince us that you really will grasp the nettle where they perhaps didn't, and that whoever follows you is not going to simply trot out the same line as everybody else has when appointed?
I haven't made the claim that I've inherited a failed organisation. I've been really clear that I believe there's been significant achievements by the FCA over many years with committed, purposeful employees, and I saw that evidence firsthand during the pandemic. The intensity and the effort and the speed with which our colleagues worked. What I have said is that, of course, we've made mistakes and there are lessons to be learned. And as a learning organisation, we want to focus on those. I think the assessment will be through the accountability frameworks we have and through Parliament. And you've seen some of the changes we're looking to make in terms of our operational focus, and that's certainly something I've been focusing on very closely. The skills and leadership we brought in, including on financial crime and data, right around the leadership table to help us address some of those really pressing issues that we have. I talked earlier about the outcomes and metrics that we want to start to be evaluated against, which is a new journey for the FCA, and a number of the initiatives which hopefully enable us to move faster and more decisively. I've talked about some of the changes to our decision making. We've also introduced a use it or lose it regime to enable us to move quickly against those firms who have a regulated license but are not earning any regulated income. That is now working its way through, and with recent legislation we can move faster as well. We're also seeking to, as I said, make sure we're testing our powers properly. We've taken, since I've joined, in a case that was underway before I arrived, but now moving through the first criminal action on money laundering against a UK bank as well. So I think you'll just have to hopefully see these processes of progress. And of course, I respect the fact that everyone's going to make a judgment for themselves, and look forward to engaging with you in the years ahead.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Mark. Next one's from Richard Emery. It's about reimbursements to victims. Richard Emery. Thank you, Richard.
In the webinar on the 15th of July this year, you talked about the difficult judgments that you need to make, balancing a desire to act decisively to tackle harmful behaviour as soon as we suspect it, with a need to act with procedural fairness, avoiding the risk of tipping off fraudsters and losing vital evidence. In cases where the FCA decides against being more assertive, it may result in the FCA being faced with a complaint along the lines of DISP 2.77 that it did not do enough to prevent or respond to an alleged authorised push payment fraud. What processes and provisions will you be putting in place to recognise and reimburse victims of any harmful behaviour when you had reasonable suspicions or even clear evidence about what was happening, but decided to defer taking action, and that deferral resulted in consumers losing money?
Look, I think this is a really challenging environment that a lot of our frontline colleagues work on. I think I dealt with the issue of compensation, those issues earlier. I don't have anything to add to that, but I'm glad you drew attention, Richard, to the comments I made on the 15th of July, because like any enforcement agency, we have, in dealing with cases, have to make sometimes difficult choices, and there isn't always a clear-cut right answer. And I've seen this now in a few cases where we have concerns that fraud is being undertaken, and we could go in quickly and close the entity down. But in doing that, those consumers who have already invested are very unlikely to get their money back, because we tip off the fraudsters, the evidence would be dissipated, and quite often the culprits are overseas. And so you have a difficult judgment to make, as sometimes the police do as well, frankly, in some of the crimes they investigate and the cases they investigate. How long allow something to run so that you can try and stop the harm, but also gather enough evidence to prosecute the offenders and then deal with the offenders afterwards. So that's the conundrum we have. I think what you're seeing is we have moved earlier than perhaps in the past in certain cases, and that's been the direction of travel. But in each case, it's going to be a balancing act, which is context specific, and very often in these cases, we're not working on our own. We're working in partnership with other criminal and enforcement agencies as well, not just in the UK.
Thank you. And our next question is coming from Pauline Creasy. It's about payment institutions. Pauline Creasy.
Thank you. Thank you to Nikhil and his team for actually saying that they are prepared. I think it was Sheldon who said they're prepared to educate the customer on consumer products in the financial services industry. As a leader of a claimants group, I want to tell you it's been the worst 3 years of my life trying to get to grips with financial law and payment service regulations. And I'm an economist by background, but I really think you do need to educate the customer and the consumer generally. I think it's a really important job for the FCA, and I'm so glad to hear to say you're going to do it. There have been previous members of the FCA who've said to the Treasury Committee that it was not the job of the FCA to educate the consumer. So I'm really grateful for that statement you made tonight, and I really hope you continue to do it. My question specifically is, the FCA brought in a new insolvency regime for payment institutions and electronic money on the 8th of July to introduce a speedier process for payment institutions that become insolvent due to fraud or more malpractice or both. If client accounts were segregated and designated correctly by the payment institution and the banker, according to the payment service regulations, insolvency and the disappearance of clients' money should not occur ever. Surely the very reason for the FCA bringing in such regulation must be to avoid or stop what the insolvency process and practitioners are doing to payment service users. There's been 6 PI insolvencies since 2018. I'm not asking you to comment on any specific cases, but it raises an important question, and it's this. Should the public who have had their money stolen or used in a Ponzi scam scheme by a payment institution be able to use this shift in policy regulation for compensation regarding excessive liquidation charges and poor or non-existent regulation, particularly amongst the small and medium-sized payment institutions, which is rather different from obviously the large banks, which in my distinct impression over the last 3 years, you focus on and you tend to ignore through light touch regulation, the small and medium firms. My point is the mere fact that the payment service regulator and the FCA have introduced such changes acknowledges the regulator's awareness of the high risk associated with payment institutions, particularly the ones that you're not regulating closely, i.e. the small and medium firms. These changes you made will not have been in the pipeline for several years, as such changes don't happen overnight. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Thanks, Pauline. There's a lot of questions in there. I might ask Sheldon to share his perspective as well. Look, of course, the payment landscape and legislation around this has been a matter for government. There's the payment landscape review underway. We're really pleased that the government did introduce a new special administration regime for insolvent payment institutions and electronic money institutions. We think that is important for the reasons you described, and to provide protections for consumers and align the regime to other regimes under our scope. The payments landscape is moving really fast. It's one of these tensions we have between supporting new technology and new developments, but making sure that the consumer protection is appropriate, and also actually not just consumer protection, systems and controls to tackle money laundering and financial crime as well. Sheldon, would you like to add anything more? Also, actually, I'll make one more point. You raised the point around communications with consumers, and we are doing more. We are one actor in this. Again, the reason you may have heard predecessors talk about it is obviously there are other actors where they've got specific legislative responsibility around this. Parliament, so Money Advice and Pension Service has a specific responsibility, but we are seeking to be more proactive. You may have seen, for example, we've been very clear, or seeking to be as clear as we possibly can, for example, about some high-risk assets like crypto assets, trying to get the message out to consumers: if you invest in this stuff, you need to only invest money you can afford to lose, because there are really significant risks around this. And that is certainly one area where I hope the Transparency Task Force can work with us, because we are concerned about the millions of people that still do invest, perhaps not fully understanding the risks. But Sheldon, on the payments, but is there any more you might want to?
I mean, payments is a key priority in our business plan, and I think it goes to the heart of what you were saying there, Pauline. What we say in our business plan is we're aiming to ensure that when consumers make payments, they don't lose money because firms fail. So, at the end of the day, payment institutions should be holding sufficient money. So if they end up with problems, it's not the consumer who ends up holding the can. In your question, I'm always open and transparent. In your question is a question about compensation retrospectively. I can't really answer that question in the sense that we did not have powers, and that's why we worked worked with government in order to introduce these new special administration regime powers. What we do have is powers in order to, and we are working with the institutions to try and get these in place to ensure that they do hold sufficient money for when things go wrong. They can sort things out quickly. In addition to that, some of the challenges we've seen in the space is not just that they don't have the money, they don't know where it is. So they're moving it around different jurisdictions, different banks, etc. So if you remember the Wirecard incident just last year, that was an incident of that. So it's a key priority for us, and we're working very closely. And I'd say, actually, I'd be public about it. We get quite a lot of resistance to the things that we're trying to put in place with some of the parts of that industry. So there'll be public letters from associations from that industry directly to Nikhil, which say, you're putting too much pressure on us, what you're trying to do is unreasonable. And I think when we come on to calls like this, I think sometimes people think we're very pro-business, we're very pro-financial services, and I don't think that's the case. We seek to be independent and objective, seek to support consumers whilst also creating a position where business can rightly flourish and innovate to serve consumers safely. And I think that's one of those examples of that. But it's a good question and one which we're actively working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon and Pauline and Nikhil. We go to Dr. Roger Miles, who has a question for you, Nikhil, about diversity and inclusion. Dr. Roger Miles, please take yourself off mute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thanks everyone for some interesting points. Nikhil, Rathi, you've been vocal in advocating that firms recognise diversity and inclusion as drivers of more open-minded thinking, which is great. But what measures do you plan to look for in each firm to monitor their specific progress with this?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. It is something that I've talked about a lot, and as has Sheldon as well. And we do see this as a regulatory issue. We see it as relevant to conduct risk. We see it as relevant to healthy cultures in institutions, as well as, of course, the moral dimensions around many aspects of diversity and inclusion. There have been some very, very good and promising initiatives. The Women in Finance Charter, for example, setting the target of senior leadership teams having gender balance by 2025. We're now on track ourselves to achieve that, hitting 45% recently. Hopefully we'll get there for 2025. There are similar initiatives, Parker Review and others around ethnicity too. And I'm pleased that my colleague Georgina Philippou is also working hard on the social mobility task force too, particularly on diversity of background and the work that we're doing on other characteristics as well. Well, in terms of the measures, we put a discussion paper out there, so we'd really love your contributions to this, Roger. They're really open conversations. So there's those kind of hard numerical metrics about representation and transparency and disclosures around that. I think that's one measure. The other is engaging with boards to understand how they are themselves holding their executives to account on cultural matters. So internal whistleblowing, for example, is one example, how they are able to assess how open the organisation is when feedback is coming through about conduct concerns, in particular, for example, non-financial misconduct, sexual misconduct as well, which I think has been something which my colleagues have spoken much more about. We've also floated the idea as to whether the remuneration code should be looked at, and the extent to which in the senior manager remuneration some of these factors should find their way in as a matter of best practice, and we're seeking comments and thought around that. It is a delicate and balanced issue in some measures of diversity, because obviously we deal with international firms, and the kind of composition, what is diversity can be different in different countries depending on local circumstances. So we just have to think about how we can regulate for the UK, but also for the international firms that we regulate here as well. So I hope that gives you some sense of play. But you'll hear us talk about this, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot in the next few years, and you'll hear Sheldon too. And Sheldon will want to add his own perspective on it.
So let's go to Ian Davis, who has a question about promotions. So let's go back to Ian Davis with your question, please, about promotions. Thank you.
Hello again. Yes, when a non-authorised company uses the services of an FCA regulated company under Section 21 of the SMMA to approve their promotion, what steps are taken by the FCA to ensure that that approval of that promotion is legitimately carried out, and that the FCA regulated company approving the promotion has no conflicts of interest?
Ian, you're onto a good point. It's not a regime that we've been particularly satisfied with, and we're pleased that the Treasury has moved ahead to enable the sanctioning of financial promotions to have its own specific regulatory gateway. But clearly, as part of ongoing supervision, financial promotions, firms that are authorising financial promotions must meet the standards and principles in our rule book and demonstrate to us that they do so. But as you all know, and I think the reason you asked the question, there've been all kinds of issues with that, which is why we are supportive of the changes that are now winding their way through, and why we're also so vocal around the online safety bill, and why we are really keen to see paid for online advertising within that bill, because we believe that is a really significant vector for fraudulent behaviour, which is leading vulnerable consumers into scams where they're losing significant parts, if not all of their life savings. Sheldon, anything more on financial promotions you'd like to add? I know you've been working.
No, look, I think you've covered it. I mean, I think we've been working very closely with the government to try and change aspects of the regime, then introduce a new regulatory gateway for firms approving financial promotions for unauthorized persons. So then, once that's in place, firms only be allowed to approve financial promotions once they've applied to us and got through the gateway and authorized to do so, which we think is an improvement. But as Nikhil says, we're not stopping there in terms of what we want to see in terms of legislation. It's not up to us to provide that. Please speak to your MPs and parliamentarians, because we do think that as part of the online safety bill, as Nikhil has said, there are gaps in terms of what we can do. And it would be good to get that paid online advertising, something that we can directly tackle and other regulators can tackle. So that I think one of the points here is that the regime is very particular. I don't know when it was designed, probably should do, but when it was designed, it was less complex in terms of how people could be promoted and advertised to in terms of financial services products. The world has changed significantly, and we do need a regime which has the relevant powers which fit for purpose to meet some of those challenges. But that's not to excuse. We do have powers and we can, and as Nikhil has mentioned, many of his initial meetings have been with Google, which tells you some of the focus that we have in terms of the elements that we need to focus on in order to tackle the way new technology, the new way in which we consume financial services raises different risks and different challenges for consumers.
A question from myself to Nikhil. Nikhil, do the Nolan principles, which, as you know, are about conduct in public office, apply to the FCA at the moment? If they don't, why don't they? And would you agree to apply them in the future as one of the meaningful changes brought about by your transformation programme?
The application of the Nolan principles, they're a matter for Parliament, and so that's a decision for Parliament which they haven't taken to date. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to apply really high standards to the way we operate, which is, we touched on the SMCR previously, and we touched on the accountability regime we have to Parliament as well, plus the various other mechanisms around us in terms of transparency and accountability. But obviously, the ultimate application of the principles you ask for is a decision for legislators, not us.
Thank you. And we go back to Mark Bishop, who has a question about providing input to the transformation process.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So, Nikhil, your decision to appoint Megan Butler to head up the transformation programme has been criticised by the Treasury Committee. Given how important it is that the programme benefits from diverse thinking and enjoys the support of external stakeholders, would you welcome the opportunity to work with us and with similar groups to provide stakeholder inputs to this transformation process?
Thanks, Mark. And the specifics of Megan obviously were raised by the Treasury Committee, and I responded, and they've issued a conclusion in the last few days. Very pleased with the way in which we're engaging with the recommendations they've made. As you know, as a new CEO coming in, you have to make sure you've got the right balance between new colleagues arriving and skills and experience, institutional memory, and that's what I explained to the Treasury Committee. We have our annual public meeting coming up in the coming days, as Andy described. So there will be an opportunity for TTF, for you personally, and for a wide range of stakeholders to give us input. And I haven't been to one of those before. That's going to be my first one, but as I understand it, those participating in those conversations do not hesitate to give us inputs through that channel, or also in writing as well. Andy, I wonder whether we, if I may, have a young family too, so I probably have to wrap up fairly shortly, if you don't mind.
Sure, that's fine. This is a genuine question. I've had a request by text from our next speaker, Dr. Andy Schmulow. Dr. Schmulow is a well-known academic in Australia. He's got up very early, not just to participate, but also to have the session after this part of the program finishes. And I think he wants to put a question to you about regulatory capture. I totally respect the fact that you weren't expecting this question. So please feel free, if you wish, to not accept receiving the question, or if you're happy to hear it, then please let's enable Dr. Schmulow to put the question to you. It's your decision, Nikhil. Thank you very much. Dr. Schmulow, please put your question to Nikhil. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Rathi, or good evening. I've had the opportunity in Australia to have an impact on mitigating the capture of our regulators that has been identified in many instances over the last 10 years, and those instances were confirmed by the Royal Commission of Inquiry that we had here recently, where Royal Commissioner and former High Court Justice Kenneth Hayne found that our regulators were deeply and profoundly captured. And this leads into the discipline of regulatory capture and capture theory and the science behind that, a science that has been contributed to by Nobel laureates like Stiglitz, which finds that all regulators are susceptible to capture, but none more so than regulators of the financial industry. And that capture can take many forms. It can take the form at the one end of the spectrum of corruption, perhaps somewhat more towards the middle of the spectrum, the revolving door, and then at the more insidious end of the spectrum, it takes the form of cognitive and ideational capture, but capture nonetheless. And in light of the fact that there have been some quite significant failings that the FCA has ratcheted up, as explored by Dame Gloucester and Mr. Justice Parker, and indeed failings that precede you and precede the FCA and go back as far as your predecessor, the FSA, failings that seem to some to be a pattern of failures, a pattern of regulatory fecklessness. I'm wondering if you can tell me what steps you have taken to mitigate capture in your own organisation.
Yeah, well, let me just share a little bit about my own experience. So, I first started working on financial stability and financial services issues pre the 2008 financial crisis. I saw firsthand the scale of damage that can occur when culture and ethics in financial institutions disappear, and not just in one institution, but system-wide. So I come from a generation of policymakers, I think, that is quite alert to the systemic and macroeconomic damage that can occur in those situations. And I know that, as Sheldon described earlier, my colleagues around the FCA are very keen to make sure that we stay objective and deliver against our objectives, which have been set by Parliament, right, in terms of consumer protection, but also to be proportionate, to do cost-benefit assessments in a transparent way, which is what we're obliged to do. I don't think I've come to an organisation which is subject to regulatory capture. As I said, the second day I was here, the organisation took the insurance industry to the Supreme Court to ensure that business interruption claims were paid out fairly consistent with contracts, and £750 million has been paid out since then. That's not a sign of a regulator that was captured by that particular sector at all. And I can give you many other examples. You mentioned the independent reviews, and we're taking those recommendations very seriously, and we report on them to Parliament. I've also asked Raj Park, whom you specifically mentioned, to, now his review is complete, to come work with us as an advisor to help ensure that our systems and controls meet the standards that he described in his report. So there's a number of things that we're doing, and while I appreciate and respect the work that you've done in Australia, I wouldn't suggest that has an automatic read across to our system here. I think we've got purposeful colleagues who work very hard in the public interest and the interests of in the interest of consumers, recognising there are things we can do better in the future. Yeah.
And Nikhil, I'll just add to that. I mean, I think I agree with everything that you've said there. Where I would agree with Andy is that from an objective perspective, from a theoretical perspective, and actuality, that the revolving door issue is one that can lead organizations into the circumstances that you end up with regulatory capture. And the reason why I add it is that we have a wide mix of people within the organization, and I think that gives the right sort of balance. So we have some people who do come from industry. We have many people who've worked in the public sector their whole life. And of course, we have grads who've just come out of university. We also have people who've not worked in financial services before, who bring in new skills as well. And I think if you get that balance right, that really does and you get your values right and your objectives right, as Nicholas said, that permeates an organization and can really help with avoiding some of those issues. I think to add to Nikhil, not just the business interruption insurance, we've just taken a massive case on general insurance pricing practices with that industry, which effectively stops them from price walking consumers 10 times from their price. A captured regulator would never do that to the vested interest of the whole of the insurance industry across the UK. And we've been firm that that is what is happening, and we've intervened. And we have many examples of those. So I recognize, Andy, that regulatory capture is a real thing and can happen. I don't think that it's part of some of the causal effects of some of those failures that we've seen at the FCA.
Thank you very much indeed, Sheldon, and also Nikhil, and of course Ian Searle as well. That's been, from my point of view, a very, very constructive, open, candid bit of dialogue between the Transparency Task Force and the Financial Conduct Authority. I personally am very grateful that you've given us this opportunity to have engagement. We'll continue to be the critical friend that we see our role to be. We will continue to have that approach because we think it's ultimately a constructive and healthy way for us to behave as a stimulant, hopefully, for improvements in the future. Can I please ask all attendees here present today to show their appreciations of Nikhil, Andy and Sheldon for attending and participating and dealing with the questions they've dealt with. Thank you very much indeed. Let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. We're going to go all the way back to Sydney now to Dr. Andy Schmulow, who got up at a very, very early time to be with us today. So, Dr. Schmulow, it's now time for your presentation. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
One of the things I'm going to pick up on, and here I tip my hat to one of my colleagues who's on the call here today, Stephen Scott of Starling Trust, the excellent piece of analysis that Starling has put out on the normalization of deviance and how talking the talk as it is transmitted to walking the talk, how that becomes corrupted. And it becomes corrupted also at the regulator. And one of the things that we have seen is how regulators, as one author put it, regulators go from vim and vigor in their youth to torpor and senescence in old age, where they go from being in conflict with the industry that they are meant to regulate to becoming weary, overloaded by their caseload and by an administrative burden, and no longer wanting to be in conflict with that industry and wanting to sort of have an unofficial truce where the peace is maintained, where we maintain a ceasefire. And what I found was interesting about the responses to my question tonight to Messrs. Rathi and Mills about regulatory capture, and their response, which was, we are not captured. Maintaining the view that you are not captured is the quickest and shortest route to capture that there is. It is only when you are constantly vigilant against the disease, it is only when you acknowledge that the disease is attacking you at every turn, that every one of the people who work for you is susceptible to capture, only when you are constantly vigilant and constantly remind yourself that it is your role and your purpose to be in conflict with that industry, that it is not your purpose to be its cheerleader, its guide, its glee club. Only then do you get to the point where you have a regulator that is persistently effective. So, you know, one of the things that we saw with Boeing, which is such an interesting story, and there, again, I tip my hat to Stephen Scott and to Starling Trust and the excellent piece of analysis that they put out on the normalization of deviance. Boeing is a company that has survived. You know, we live in a world today where we think of aircraft manufacturers as either Boeing or Airbus, and we don't really think of anything else. There was a time when there were a lot of aircraft manufacturers. There was Hughes, there was de Havilland, there was McDonnell, there was Douglas, there was Boeing. There were all sorts of manufacturers. And there was a time, a long time ago, when Boeing started to stake out its claim as the safest manufacturer, or the manufacturer of the safest aircraft in the world. There was a time when people used to say, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going. And Boeing has drilled down into the... Is that me? Is that my feedback? No. Boeing has drilled down into the safety for generations. They began with this commitment, and they doubled down on this commitment, and they held this commitment as their value proposition. Then something happened. A couple of things happened. The first thing that happened is that Airbus engaged in a vanity project, and they went down the route of manufacturing the A380, which has been an absolute, from a commercial perspective, a disaster. It's had a 10-year lifespan. They're not making them anymore. The few airlines that are flying them are retiring them. They are pretty much worthless on the second-hand aircraft market. The A380 got 10 years, it was gone. They're still manufacturing the 747, not as a passenger aircraft, it is to be said, but they're still manufacturing the 747 as a cargo aircraft. The 747 chassis has given Boeing 50 years. So Boeing looked at the A380 and they said, it's a vanity project, it's not going to work. When it fails, we'll be able to say, we told you so. And it did fail, and Boeing covered themselves in hubris. And while they were covering themselves in hubris, something else happened that they weren't watching. Airbus began to revise and to produce a replacement for the A320, and the A320 cuts into Boeing's bread and butter market, the 737. Boeing was caught short. They underestimated the threat that the A320 posed, and when that threat materialized, instead of Boeing adhering to their core values, safety, first, second, and third, they began to normalize deviance. They started to say, we need to cut corners just on this occasion. We're not going to do it all the time. We're just going to cut corners on this occasion. Why? Because our survival is at stake. The 737 is our bread and butter market. The A320 is cutting into that market. On this occasion, what we'll do is we'll do a couple of things. We'll lengthen the chassis. We'll put engines under the wings that are so big that we can't actually fit them under the wings. So we have to put them in front of the wings and on top of the wings. That makes the plane unstable. We'll put some software into the operation that will make sure the plane doesn't dive into an attack. We can't have double redundancy because then that means pilots have to be retrained. So we'll just cut a corner on this occasion, and we'll make sure that we survive. Those corner cutting processes led to 2 fatalities, a massive destruction of Boeing's reputation, the collapse in orders for the 737 MAX, then the collapse in orders for the new 777 and for the 787. And while all of this was going on, the evidence emerged that the FAA had a relationship with Boeing, which was so subservient that it was standard practice at the FAA, you don't question Boeing. If Boeing tells you up is down and black is night, then up is down and black is white. And not only did this serve Boeing very poorly, it served the traveling public very poorly, it served the FAA very poorly, and it allowed Boeing to normalize that deviance. So we then started to hear stories about 787s being delivered with tools being left inside the fuselage, which is akin to a surgeon leaving a piece of operating equipment inside a patient. It became absolutely disastrous. That normalization of deviance takes place not just in regulated entities, it takes place in regulators as well, which is why when Mr. Rathi said, we are not captured, we've taken on the big end of town. You've taken on the big end of town today, but what about all the other times when you didn't take on the big end of town? What about the criticisms that were delivered against the FCA by the Gloucester Report and by the Parker Review? What about all the people who are members of the TTF Forum who have stories about how they blew whistles and they weren't protected, or how they reported misconduct to the FCA and the FCA did nothing about it because on this occasion it's too difficult. On this occasion, we don't see the need. So regulatory capture is so insidious that I don't accept that you are insulated from regulatory capture unless you accept it exists in your organization at all times.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting indeed. And could I invite you, please, Dr. Schmulow, to go on to talk about the developments in Australia, just briefly in terms of oversight, and then we'll go to Roger Miles and Pauline Creasy, who'd like to make a point or two as well. So what's happened in Australia to try to counterbalance this risk of regulatory failure?
So I've been arguing like a stuck gramophone record since 2014 that we need a board of oversight over our regulators. Our regulators are world-class in terms of how just appallingly badly they do their job. We are the gold standard in terms of regulators that are weak, feckless, timid, incompetent, and captured. And there has been so much evidence of this for such a long time that I made a submission to the 2014 Murray inquiry in which I argued that we need a board of oversight, and that submission was accepted. And the Murray inquiry recommended the establishment at recommendation number 27 of a financial regulator assessment board, an FRAB. That was the only recommendation that was rejected by the then Abbott government under a very concerted pushback by our prudential regulator and Treasury. Misconduct continued, the activities of our weak and feckless and suborned regulators continued until we had our Royal Commission in 2018, 2019. And again, well, on that occasion, I was invited to make a submission to the Royal Commission, and the submission that I made was that here is a vast body of evidence of capture. The capture of our regulators set against the theoretical understanding of what constitutes capture, so that we can understand that the capture of our regulators is capture properly so-called, and that the only way you can short-circuit that is to have a board of oversight, provided, of course, and this is essential, that the board of oversight is critical, independent, at arm's length, and makes its findings publicly available, that it puts its findings into the public domain. This is what one author referred to as riffing off work that had been done by Charles Francis Adams Jr., who, writing in the 1860s, observed capture of the railroad commissions by the railroad barons in the United States. United States, obviously, where they refer to them as railroads. Adams argued very forcefully that the only way to short circuit this capture was to identify it, expose it, and put it in the public domain where it would be subjected to public opprobrium. As I say, what one author referred to as a Sunshine Commission, which ties in not only to the work that the TTF does, but to a remark made, a very famous remark by the former United States Chief Justice William Brandeis, who said, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." Now, there have been a lot of people who've said, this is going to be another level of bureaucracy. It's going to be a further cost to the taxpayer. It will simply be more of the same. It'll achieve nothing. Let me point out to you that the work that such a board can do has already been done on an ad hoc basis. So in 2019, we had a Treasury review of our prudential regulator, conducted by Graham Samuel. Professor Samuel is a tour de force and not a person to be pushed around. Good luck trying that. And he and his team of panelists investigated our prudential regulator, and the findings were an excoriation. I'll give you a couple of examples. He referred to APRA's tendency to deploy a patronage-based system of promotion, which is a polite way of saying, the better you kiss somebody's behind, the higher will be the behinds that you kiss. He referred to APRA's middle management as chronic underperformers. He quoted staff who had more junior staff who said, this organization is so dysfunctional, it should be shut down. That review is on the record. APRA will do another review of APRA. There will be another review of APRA next year. And because the reviews will take place every 2 years, there will now be a short enough space of time to say to the leadership of APRA, here are the findings that were brought down 2 years ago. Let's have a look at which of those findings you've addressed. And if you haven't addressed them, then you need to start giving us reasons why you shouldn't be shown the door. So I provided this advice to our Royal Commission. It was accepted as a formal recommendation 6.14, which to my astonishment was adopted by the government in the form of the Financial Regulator Assessment Authority Bill, FRAA. I and three of my colleagues analysed the bill. We tore it to pieces, and we found a number of different issues that we weren't happy with, the most salient of which was the involvement of our Treasury. The theoretical work that had been done to date was very clear. Government must not be involved with this Board of Oversight, because if government is involved, then the Treasurer will ensure that the board pursues analysis of the performance of the regulators, which ties in with government policy, and government policy is government of the day. That's all it is. It's a transient thing. And it had got through the lower house, and I made some very impassioned representations to members of the Senate. And I said to them, you have got to take Treasury out of this bill. And through a very complex parliamentary process, which I don't fully understand, one of our senators proposed amendments which stripped Treasury out of the FRAA. It then went back to the lower house where we thought it would be rejected, but people were preoccupied with COVID. And so it was passed. It was passed and it received royal assent on the 29th of June. Treasury has been taken out of the bill. I believe I will no longer be receiving a Christmas card from Treasury. It'll go with the lack of Christmas cards that I get from Commonwealth Bank and Westpac. I'm sure I'll survive somehow. So we've got Treasury out of the bill. We've got the FRA will start its work this year. They will do a capability review of ASIC. I'm not happy with the people who've been appointed to the FRAA. They are bankers. They are industry insiders, but good luck to them trying to soft soap ASIC's performance. They'll just make a fool of themselves. And then the arguments will be made, and they will be made because people like me will be making them. The wrong people are on the board. Get rid of Simon Moore. He's an ex-Macquarie banker. He shouldn't be there. He's soft-soaped ASIC's review. ASIC is our version of the FCA. So it's imperfect. It's not exactly as I would like to see it, but we're getting there. I will say this, though. There have been moves of late to adopt something similar in the United Kingdom, moves that have been spearheaded by Sharon Bowles, the Baroness Berkhamsted, and I must say, the proposals that she has put forward are without a doubt an advance on the Australian position. The position that Sharon Bowles has taken is absolutely outstanding. She is a tour de force. She is a considerable force in the regulatory space. I cannot speak highly enough of her ladyship. And the proposal that she put forward as an amendment in the House of Lords, which unfortunately was stymied by the Conservatives, was not only an advance on the Australian position. What I liked about it was that it was so short and so simple and so efficient. So I think that where you have recursive reviews, where those reviews are independent and critical, where they are placed on the public record, and where they take place in with a short enough gap that you can hold current leadership responsible for not implementing changes in lieu of the recommendations made in the last review. So in other words, you don't want to have a gap of 10 years because otherwise you'll have someone like Mr. Rathi say, it's not my fault, it happened before I was here. You want to be able to hold them to account from this review to the last review. I think that where you can have reviews that are critical, arm's length, are not beholden by industry insiders, you can start to really deeply mitigate the bias towards industry, and you can start to hold regulators to account for their failings in respect of instances like Connaught and London Capital Finance. You can start to say to them, you had multiple complaints. You had hundreds, if not thousands of people complaining about Connaught and London Capital Finance. You saw firms that were operating at scale. There was clear evidence that what they were doing was wrong. Why did you not act?
Thanks, Andy. We'll hold it there. We're going to go to Roger Miles, then Pauline Creasy, then Mark Falcon for their input. Then we're going to go to Mark Bishop. This has been a wonderfully fascinating session, both comparing and contrasting the presentations we had earlier, the Q&A, and now this insight from Dr. Schmulow about the magnificent progress that's been made in Australia that clearly Baroness Bowles is looking to advance for the UK. Roger, to you, please. We are needing to keep an eye on the time, so if I can invite everybody, please, to be as succinct as possible. I know that we would all love to carry on talking about this for hours and hours and hours. Roger Miles, Dr. Miles, please share your point. Thank you.
Andy, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Andy Schmulow, for a really interesting view of Australia's answer to the question of who will guard the guards themselves. There are lots of theories around regulatory capture, and Stephen, who's also on this call, hi Stephen, and I have written about this in other forums. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, of academics like Dan Carpenter and Diane Vaughan, who've already talked about this. I think the lessons for finance, we've got to be careful in a read across from aviation to finance, that some things carry and others don't. I had the good fortune to study with one of the world's leading professors on regulatory capture, Henry Rothstein in London, who said, if you can tick any or all 5 of these 5 boxes, you can see regulatory capture happening. So let me just quickly offer the 5 to this group, and then we can perhaps discuss. So longevity of providers. So I'm thinking of certain banks who've been around since the Opium Wars in China. Deep pockets. So the industry's collective capital muscle is greater than the government that's trying to regulate it. Virtuality or borderless products, things which can be moved, which are blips on screens rather than physical in the real world. Expendable or portable labor, so we can collapse our workforce in one jurisdiction and expand it in another without penalty. And finally, lack of concerted public challenge. And it's really that final point that I want to hammer in this forum, because we are the concerted public challenge. Thank you, Andy. Just one other point on capture. There is a counter theory or complementary theory that comes out of the Netherlands. Anyone who knows me know I'm a big fan of the Dutch school. It's called the regulatory dance. And that goes to Dr. Andy, your point that the politicians who want to get re-elected normally want to get re-elected on the back of a thriving economy, which means keeping the engines of finance running. And therefore the politicians, the regulators, and the regulatees engage in this so-called regulatory dance, like a 3-legged stool, that as long as no one of the 3 parties embarrasses too much either of the other 2 parties, everything is fine. And it's basically a game of looking away or suppressing awkward information. I'm writing a study on exactly this for the UK audit profession at the moment, but don't even start me on that one in this forum. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. And yes, Andy, 2 thumbs up. Thank you, both Andys.
Thank you. I have a suggestion here. Rather than develop that particular point, I'll commit that between now and the end of the year, TTF will run a deep dive symposium on the topic of regulatory capture. Dr. Schmulow, it would be great if you were to speak. Dr. Miles, it would be great if you were to speak. Other people on this session as well. Anybody that's a renowned speaker on the topic, because I personally am of the opinion that within this topic, we have the answer to transforming the way the regulatory framework works. So great input, Dr. Miles. Thank you so much. Let's
external
now go.
Scrutiny, absolutely, is to pick up Andy's finishing point. External scrutiny, yes. Objective.
That's absolutely what we need. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Miles. Pauline Creasy, if I can also please invite you to be as succinct as you can be. Then we'll go to Mark Falcon, then we'll go to Mark Bishop. Pauline Creasy.
Thank you. Andy, in Australia, I'd really appreciate your views about this. In Britain, my interpretation of the regulator is that they're constantly looking back at what happened in 2008 and just determined not to have a crash of the big institutions where they basically didn't have enough capital reserves and sent the world into turmoil. As a result of that, they seem to be ignoring the small and medium firms which they authorize, who seem to suffer from what they call, and has been mentioned in the Treasury Committee by senior executives at the FCA, as light touch regulation, which is really an excuse for poor regulation or zero regulation. And it's particularly apparent in the payment institutions arena, which I was talking about earlier. I just wondered if you had experienced anything similar in Australia, and if you'd got any recommendations on how to deal with it. I and my claimants group and others have, including, by the way, some CEOs of payment institutions who are actually trying to do a good regular job, have been banging a drum for more than 3 years, trying to get attention to it. And we only get lip service in return. It's basically just ignored, even by well-known, by committees like the Treasury Committee and the Pension Scans Committee. It just somehow gets ignored with this focus on large institutions. But yet, most of the fraud by regulated firms is being committed by small and medium firms. So it's quite a dilemma for the consumer. I'd appreciate any advice you've got to give on that, whether you've come across a similar thing in Australia and how it might be dealt with, because we are struggling to get attention paid to it.
You know, Pauline, that is such an interesting question. And it feeds into a discussion I was having about a week ago with our shadow treasurer. And I had occasion, this may come as a surprise, I I have a tendency to be very blunt about these things. And I said to the person I was speaking to that the current head of APRA is our prudential regulator, is apart from the fact that he, as far as I'm concerned, he's a gibbering idiot, he is typical of what happens when you get a civil servant who becomes head of an organization. How does a civil servant become head of an organization? By not taking any risks. So it doesn't matter if he hasn't done a good job, as long as he can't be associated personally with a spectacular cock-up. So that's how this man has got through his career. That's his catchline. No spectacular cock-ups. And as a result of which he is now the highest paid civil servant in Australia. He's paid more than the Prime Minister. And one of the things that we see from him is we see how susceptible he is to what Paul Krugman refers to as a doom loop, what the G20 refers to as a feedback loop. And the feedback loop that I'm talking about ties into the fact that banks, unlike other firms, have a tendency to run. So even a well-capitalized, well-run, well-managed bank can find itself running, can find that there is a sudden panic in the market and herd mentality, and for no good reason. There are huge queues outside the door, as happened with Northern Rock. People are withdrawing their money, and it whips around like wildfire. Northern Rock's in trouble, and then everybody starts to withdraw their money. So that's the phenomenon of bank runs. Banks use that phenomenon to make sure that they evade any kind of punishment at all. So if a regulator says to them, we're going to give you a really hard smack, they go, don't smack us hard because it could precipitate a bank run. So then the regulator says, all right, well, we'll give you a soft smack. Oh, don't give us a soft smack, because if you give us a soft smack, the public will see that we're in trouble, and they might misinterpret that trouble to mean we're in financial trouble, and then we might have a bank run. Okay, well, we'll criticize management. Oh, you don't criticize management, because then that might undermine public confidence, and then we'll have a bank run. Okay, so what are we left with? Well, what you're left with is you can't do anything because we might have a bank run. So this becomes this feedback loop of misconduct, of betting the firm, of driving the firm into bankruptcy, of getting the taxpayer to bail you out, and doing all of this without consequence, because otherwise there might be a bank run. And one of the things I said to our shadow treasurer is, instead of having somebody like Wayne Bayers, who's a gibbering idiot, in charge of APRA, we should have somebody who's an intellectual, who's intelligent, who has a strong grasp of theory, probably somebody who has an academic background. If you wanted me to name names, Alan Fells. Alan Fells was the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. He is a regulator's titan. If you put Alan Fells in that position, he has enough intellectual horsepower to be able to say to a bank, we're giving you a hard smack. Oh, well, that could precipitate a bank run. To which Alan Fells would be able to say, yeah, it might, but I don't think it will. So here comes the smack. And he did exactly that when he was head of the Competition Commission. He had pushback from major industries saying, oh, you better not stymie this deal. You better not stymie Qantas taking over Air New Zealand, because otherwise, you know, X, Y, and Z will happen, and then the sky will fall on our heads and an iconic Australian brand will go under. And he went, what absolute nonsense. The merger is off. It'll create a monopoly. The answer is no, go away. And so the merger was off, and Qantas is to this day one of the biggest and most profitable airlines in the world. You need somebody who has the intellectual horsepower to be able to push back against the arguments that get put forward, and they get put forward all the time. But the sky will fall on our heads. No, it won't. There are measures of risk, and we will take that risk because we need to have some risk, because we need to punish you because we need to uphold the public good.
Thank you, Andy. What an interesting exchange. Thank you very much indeed. Let's now go to Mark Falcon, and then we'll go to Mark Bishop. Mr. Falcon.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy Schmulow. I think what you said is absolutely fascinating. I'm very interested to read more of your work and research, because it's been something that's that I've wrestled with throughout my career. I'm an economist, but I've been both a regulator, I've worked in industry, and I've been a consultant. So I've enjoyed the revolving door. I don't think that is the problem, and I think there is considerable benefits of having movement between industry and regulator rather than just career regulators. But I did think, though, that the FCA's response to your question was very disappointing. I think Nikhil Rathi said a lot of good things earlier, and certainly there's reason to be more confident in him than his immediate predecessors. Certainly, since Adair Turner was probably the only recent financial regulator to stand out, showing that kind of intellectual horsepower that you describe in the UK. But the answer given by Sheldon Mills was particularly disappointing, because that just smacked of the defensiveness. I mean, the example he gave of the insurance regime is itself a paradigm case of regulatory capture, because the regulator has adopted exactly the solution the industry wanted, a solution which will be completely ineffective, but the regulator believes that it's going to make a big difference. So the regulator believes, as we saw, that this solution, in that case, which requires which is supposed to stop insurance companies from price discriminating between new and old customers, is very easy for firms to evade. It's almost impossible to enforce or to for customers to see that they're benefiting from, and therefore it entirely serves the industry, while the regulator falsely believes that they've done a good job. So that was worrying to hear. But I think as well that obviously also observing what John Kay said last night. I know John well, we're former colleagues from London Economics. I think it was very disappointing what John said about that you'll never have very good regulators because they're less paid than industry, and therefore, that's just something you'll have to is going to be a matter of fact. I think that was disappointing, and also really undermines regulators, because yes, they're not as well paid as in industry, but there are some very committed people who want to work in the public sector because money is not the only motivation, and public service has a very important for many people, far greater than financial rewards, especially if it's something that they're doing which is not rewarding them in other ways, either intellectually or in having meaning and purpose. But what I think is the real culprit, but also what could make the biggest difference, is Dr. Schmulow, you referred earlier to Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, in his analysis of what's really gone wrong is the Reagan effect of politicians, from starting with Reagan, of undermining regulators, of demeaning regulators, of their status, and that's what's attracted. Meant that not only are there poor financial rewards, but regulators are not seen as having an important role and status amongst their peers and in society, and that's what's got to change, and it's got to come from politicians in really emphasising that regulators do have a very important role, that's what can make a big difference to changing the culture, rather than a regulator, a job at a regulator being seen as a second choice career. So I'll leave it at that. But Andy Agathangelou, I think this is certainly a theme which runs through the Transparency Task Force work. It's not a reason to be cynical that regulatory capture is endemic. But as Dr. Schmulow has said, what's important is to recognize the need to recognize it, and that it is ever present, or the risk of it is ever present, and therefore what are the right principles and approaches to try to mitigate it as much as possible.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. These are such interesting points. I'm going to quickly squeeze in a point from Stephen Scott from Starling Trust that Andy Schmulow mentioned earlier. So, Stephen, a quick point, please, from you. I'm emphasising the quick bit here because we still need to get to Mark Bishop. So, Stephen, please make your point to Dr. Schmulow. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here with friends like Dr. Schmulow and Roger Miles. Thanks for the shout out, guys. I'll just make the point bolstering Andy's comment about the fear of triggering a run on the bank. Where we have perpetual scandals that are misconduct in nature, as we've seen in Australia with the Hain Commission, of course, elsewhere, people lose faith in the banking system. And people lose faith in their government's readiness to hold the banking system accountable. They therefore lose faith in the system altogether. And what you saw in my country on January 6th of this year is a run on the government. So I think I understand and appreciate and may act similarly where I similarly placed as a politician, that you have to try to maintain the economy, right? Bill Clinton's line is the economy stupid. So I can see where there's a concern for triggering a run on a bank that would have economic consequences that might be disastrous. But to fail to adequately discipline the market means that you lose the basis of your nation altogether. And I'll make the point that if you ask someone in 1988 in the Soviet Union what they anticipated over the next several months, I don't think anyone would have said that we'll be gone. And this country does not have any God-given right to continue to exist. And I think we're actually at that level of existential dynamic here. So I appreciate Andy's candor and his forthrightness as always.
Thank you, Stephen Scott. Such interesting points. We're going to go back to Andy Schmulow just to very, very briefly share his final thoughts. Then Mark Bishop, go for it.
It's such a pleasure to finally meet Mr. Scott. It really is such a pleasure, honor and a pleasure. And I think what Stephen has said, it's something I said last night. The collapse in the public's faith in institutions is what led to Donald Trump. Right? We can't go on like this. And something that I want to pick up on that Mr. Falcon said, this notion that people won't work for the regulators, that people won't work in the public interest because they're less well paid is rubbish. It is absolute rubbish. Every judge that is appointed in this country earns less money than they earned when they were a barrister. There are plenty of people who work in the public interest. There are plenty of people who work in the prosecutorial service who would earn more money in private practice. They do it because they are charged with the public interest. This notion that people are only motivated by money is absolute BS. And let me end off with an anecdote to Mr. Falcon's story. No matter how bad things get, Mr. Falcon, take heart. It's worse in Australia. The deputy chair of our prudential regulator, our superannuation czar, who had oversight of a $3 trillion industry, had cited the fact that two retirement annuity, we call them superannuation, two retirement annuity companies run by one of our four big banks, two retirement annuity companies, one called MLC, one called Nulis, were charging fees that the federal government had specifically legislated as illegal. They'd been charging these fees to 500,000 superannuation members, and the fees were in the thousands of dollars per year. They were stealing at least $500 million a year, and they'd been doing it for 4 years. And when she caught them, these were her options: vary, cancel, or suspend their licenses, make them pay damages, make them remediate, make them pay a fine, remove directors from trustees from the board of trustees, publicly announce what they had done and bring opprobrium upon them. What did she instead choose to do? She gave them another 3 years to wind the practice down.
Oh my God.
Why? Because she said she was worried about a systemic risk to the market. There is no evidence anywhere in the world of a retirement annuity company running. Banks run, retirement annuity companies don't run. They don't run because they don't have demand depositors.
Yeah.
But she looked at this and she went, well, they both work in the banks and superannuation companies. They both work in the financial industry. They both work in office towers. They both go to work wearing suits. Well, I suppose they're the same. And this woman had charge of a $3 trillion industry. So no matter how bad things get in the UK, don't worry, they're worse in Australia.
Thank you. On that note, let's please show our appreciation to Dr. Schmulow. It's been a really fascinating session once again. Thank you very, very much indeed. We look forward to you coming back, Dr. Schmulow and Stephen Scott, and hopefully others as well, Mark Falcon and others who know about this topic so well, to talk, and Dr. Roger Miles, to talk about regulatory capture and these sorts of issues furthermore. Can we please invite Mr. Mark Bishop to, as concisely as he'd like to, share the point that he'd like to share. Mark Bishop, please, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'm going to share my screen because I've done a presentation. So I've called my presentation How to Fix the FCA, because that's really what we're here to debate today, but it's also how to save the FCA. And the reason why I say that is that I believe that the organisation is one more big crisis away from there being a critical mass of demand for its abolition and replacement. And I actually know where that next, I have a pretty good idea where that next crisis will come from. And it is Woodford, where literally billions of pounds have been lost of average citizens' money, much of it savings. And there is very obvious evidence that regulatory failure was the principal cause of this loss. I will also joke that this presentation is a job application. It's a job application that's gone nowhere, but I'm mentioning it in the context of the debate we've just had about whether people are willing to go and work for regulators. This job of Executive Director for Transformation of the FCA, had it been advertised, I would have applied for it. On the face of it, I'd like to think I'm at least worth interviewing, because unlike the person who got the job, who is the insider, Megan Butler, I have an MBA, in fact, from a business school that is rated either #1 or #2 in the world for organizational behavior, which is really what we're talking about here, fixing organizations. I have extensive experience in consulting, and not once in my career have I been a major causative factor in a financial services regulatory case. Again, unlike the person who got the job. I would respectfully suggest that sometimes regulators choose people for roles because of what they won't do rather than what they will do. I think that the first thing that needs to be done if we were serious about fixing the FCA is to deal with the historic cases. You need to clear the decks and clear the air. So where the FCA has made mistakes or worse, I think it should own up, should fully compensate the victims and the whistleblowers, and remove the employees within the organisation or within the industry in question. Where the industry has done the same, I believe the FCA should give it a choice between paying up or the enforcement response from hell. Whatever happens, I think it's essential to ditch the FCA's current approach: delay, deny, deflect, and defend. It's a barrier to genuine change. It's wasteful of management time and resource. It encourages further wrongdoers, because of course, every time there is an independent review or there's a story in a paper alleging regulatory failure, people within the industry and on the fringes of it who are thinking of doing bad things are emboldened. They are reminded of the fact that the regulator is not up to scratch. It positions the FCA's leadership team as untrustworthy and unwilling to confront organisational flaws. It deprives the FCA of the support of stakeholders that it needs to get on side if it really wants to change. And bad actors, particularly in the industry, will have leverage over the FCA and also see some bad actors within your organisation. If you're engaged in a cover-up and you're pretending that bad things haven't happened, you can't act against those people. They become untouchable. And there will be no-go areas. A classic case is what used to be Capita Financial Managers and is now Link Asset Services. And of course, in Archcrew, Connaught and Woodford, they were a major causative factor. The FCA cannot easily conclude its enforcement investigation against that firm and find that the firm was flawed, because that firm has so much history in which it was able to get away with bad things in the past. So new cases will keep happening until the past is confronted and dealt with. It may be that a royal commission is needed, as in Australia, or perhaps an ad hoc truth and reconciliation one. In any case, there is the need for involvement of the Treasury to create some kind of legal framework for the payment of redress, and also to deal with the solvency risk of the FCA. To put it bluntly, it cannot afford to meet these liabilities. The next thing I think the FCA needs to do, if it's serious about change, is to clear out the deadwood within its own staffing. Now, I found it really interesting to listen to Nikhil Rathi's speech or presentation today, this evening, because really he's very focused on business, on stuff to do with technology. He believes that a really good database of all of the cases that have happened, the individuals involved, and maybe some kind of deep learning technology will enable him to spot scams and fraudsters. He may be right at the margins, but actually that's not the problem we have at the moment. We're not trying to deal with the marginal stuff, we're trying to deal with the basics. The basics is when very obvious evidence exists, why is nothing done? So I actually think that you need to bring in an outside HR consultancy and to subject every employee to a performance review which looks at two particular variables. The first is performance, how capable are they? The second is focus, are they oriented toward consumer interests? Now you might think, it's a regulator that has a consumer protection competition type remit. Surely everybody who works there would be focused on consumer welfare. Well, actually not. Here is a job ad, I accept it's from a few years ago, that appeared in a major UK newspaper seeking to recruit people into senior roles in the FCA. It says there are few jobs where you can make a real difference to the 2 million people who work in the UK financial services industry. Now, there is absolutely no statutory objective of the FCA that has to do with some kind of welfare objective of the people who work in financial services. And it's in the very first sentence. Now, the problem we have here is, firstly, that a load of people will have applied and probably got jobs on the basis that this is what they are motivated to do. The second thing is that the people who placed this ad and who ran the recruitment process also were labouring under this misapprehension and may well have recruited and promoted other people on the basis of whether or not they are going to make this difference to the people who work in the industry. So culturally, there is a really big problem here. And this is, I think, the third variety of regulatory capture that Dr. Andy Schmulow talked about, the cognitive type. I believe there is extensive cognitive regulatory capture in the FCA. And to be really blunt about it, and I've said I've got an MBA and I come from a consulting background, we love our 2x2 matrices. So what you then do is you try and plot everybody on this matrix. And of course, in the top right corner, you have the stars. They are people who perform very well and they're highly focused on consumer interest. These are great people. Then you've got people who are extremely bright and capable, but they're not interested in consumer welfare. I will call them the captured. You've got people who really want to help consumers, but their performance isn't great. Let's call them the well-meant. And then you've got the people who are low performance, low consumer focus. Frankly, they're the useful idiots. It's not a nice term to use of anybody, but I couldn't think of anything kinder. So how do you handle these people? Well, the stars, it's pretty obvious. Promote them fast, almost indecently so, almost beyond the point that they feel comfortable with, because if you're going to save the organization, these are the people who are going to do it. Give them responsibility. What about the captured? Well, you try to reorient them. You tell them that the job ads that they replied to were wrong and a different thing is required of them now. Some will make it, some of them won't. Frankly, I've met some people in the FCA, including at the top, who strike me as kind of sociopathic industry shills, and those people are never going to make the change. So you have to remove those. The well-meant people, actually, you do everything you can to keep those. It may be that you can upskill them so that they can become stars, or if they have a cognitive level of ability that they cannot improve, then maybe what you do is very gently demote them, put them into roles to which they are suited. As for the useful idiots, frankly, they've got nothing to offer the organisation, and the job is to remove them. Do it humanely, but do it quickly. The next thing you need to do, I think, also talks about people, and that is hiring. You've binned a load of people, you've got to hire some new ones. And you've got to end the revolving door, crony insider hires and secondments. Here is a great tweet from Clive May, who comes along to some of these meetings. He found a particular individual who was working in the FCA, who was seconded, worse, from RBS into the FCA, and he was working on a matter related to RBS and the Section 166 review into its behaviour. Clearly unacceptable. Now, I do understand Mark Falcon's point that there is some benefit in having expertise from the industry, but I think if you buy that, you're buying it because you're buying expertise, not because you're buying influence. So you'd have to expect them to work in a different area. You'd have to expect them to sign a contract that says that they're not going to go back into the industry in an area that they have influenced while working for the regulator. But I've seen all sorts of things. For example, I've seen people seconded from the FCA into the Treasury, specifically into the private office of the Economic Secretary of the Treasury, into the Treasury Committee as well. At any one time, there's at least one person seconded from the FCA to work on the Secretariat of that body. There's the Financial Ombudsman Service, whose acting chief executive at Norske Delfas has been chief operating officer of the FCA. And this is despite the fact that the job of recruiting directors to the FOS, which is a responsibility of the FCA, states specifically in the Act of Parliament that it must be done in a way that secures its independence from the regulator. Complaints Commissioner has got one seconded or former employee of the FCA, at least that I know of. And there's also a rich seam of secondment of people from professional services firms into the FCA. At any one time, there's about 20 of them in the organisation, according to a Freedom of Information request that I put in a few years back. Recruitment must be transparent and merit-based. Never again can someone like Megan Butler get a job when there's so much shadow about her career with the regulator, and when there is a need so obviously to bring in diverse thinking to the organisation when you're wanting to change it. I've mentioned Norske Delfas, and Raj Parker, who conducted the supposedly independent review into what happened with Connaught, as Nikhil Rathi quite interestingly owned up to, he has now been employed by the FCA as a senior legal advisor. What he didn't tell you is that that role, that nice little sinecure as Raj moves into semi-retirement, was never advertised. No search consultants were briefed to the role, and no other candidates were ever considered for this position. It does feel like a thank you job. Work with outside stakeholders as well on appointment panels and the processes. If you really are interested in change, there is talent, expertise, and independent thinking outside the organisation. I think it's also important for the FCA to hire what I call diverse thinkers, and not just people who are demographically diverse. Here's a great publicity shot of the character Detective Inspector Gene Hunt from the TV drama series Ashes to Ashes. He plays a part that can be perhaps a bit racist, sexist, and homophobic, and we don't want those things, and I'm absolutely not advocating them. And nor am I advocating hiring people who are necessarily middle-aged white guys like me. That's not the aim of the exercise. The aim of the exercise is to hire people who think differently, and that may be because they have different life experiences. They have done different things in their careers. So what I'm proposing here is positive action to attract mid or late career professionals into key roles. Target those from outside financial services and outside of the professional services that service it. Look for the drive and experience to nail the bad actors, mostly but not only in enforcement. So senior detectives with complex case experience, like Mr. Hunt here. Intelligence and security services officers. Investigative journalists, I've been one. Action group leaders and campaigners and whistleblowers. Talking about which, here's an interesting point. Unless anybody has rejoined this call while I've been presenting. I think I'm right in saying that the three individuals from the FCA who presented to us earlier this evening all left. Nikhil Rathi went and his foot soldiers went at the same time. They've all gone. And yet people who run action groups, campaigners, whistleblowers, academics, including ones from different continents, are all still on the call. That kind of tells you something, I think. So promote and empower and do it fast. Transform your treatment of whistleblowers and evidence. Nikhil Rathi, I think, in response to a question from Paul Carlier, talked about the In Confidence with Confidence campaign that the FCA is running at the moment, which it believes is the solution to its problem with whistleblowers. But here's a nice little quote from the press release. Mark Stewart, Executive Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight at the FCA, said, "We want all whistleblowers to feel welcomed by us and to feel safe because of us. We listen to all whistleblowers and, if they shine a light on serious misconduct, we want to make sure we act responsibly. When whistleblowing works well, it helps consumers, markets and firms and keeps everyone safe. And that's our aim." Now, if I were a potential whistleblower and I read this, I would be thinking, okay, it says here that we list all whistleblowers, and if they shine a light on serious misconduct, we want to make sure we act responsibly. Now, what is serious misconduct? And what will happen if the misconduct that I shine a light on is not deemed to be serious by the FCA? Does it mean that they will not make sure that they act responsibly? Is there a risk that they may do nothing about it, or that they leave me exposed and at risk of my career? Now, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, Alex Varley-Winter, Head of Investigative Reporting at Transparency Task Force, published a blog which looked at what happened to the whistleblowing leads that came into the FCA last year. I can tell you what happened. More than half of them that came in the calendar year 2020, nobody has done a thing with them yet. They are untouched. That's pretty unusual. Of those that have been touched, only a tiny proportion have had what they call serious or material action taken. So what this tells me, and Mark Stewart, I'm not criticising Mark Stewart individually. I think this is a cultural problem throughout the FCA, and it may be worse in other places than it is in his mind, but certainly I think he has a problem with it. I think there's a huge cultural challenge, and the solution is hire a load of whistleblowers in numbers and into senior roles and do it quick. Hold empathy briefings and set up buddying schemes for staff. This applies not just to whistleblowers, so they hear them, but also to wronged consumers and owners of SMEs. What we really need is the people who work in the FCA to be turned. Do you remember I talked about how we could turn the well-intentioned into stars? We want them to really empathise with and understand the minds of victims of regulatory failure and financial services misconduct and whistleblowers. Dame Elizabeth Gloucester, after the LCF report, told the Treasury Committee that defective culture is at the heart of the FCA's failings. You wouldn't guess that by reading her report, but it's what she told them, and I believe it's the truth. So, you know, nice to spend £120 million on new technology, probably not going to do any harm, might even help a little bit at the edges, but it's not the solution to your problem. Culture drives activity and outcomes, and the solutions I'm putting forward, I hope, try and address those problems. So my next solution or recommendation is don't take a pencil sharpener to a gunfight. Let me give you an example of what I mean. This is a comedy gem from the FCA's careers team. Nice quick tweet from them. There aren't many jobs where you have the opportunity to question CEOs of banks at the age of 22, says Sean, a member of their graduate training program. Now, anybody sane would say there's a reason why there aren't many jobs where 22-year-olds are questioning CEOs of banks. And being even more cynical, there is a reason why the FCA might want a 22-year-old graduate trainee to be interviewing the CEO of a bank. It's because he's not going to get to ask any difficult questions. He's not going to spot anything uncomfortable about the answers. So we must put an end to what I call three-monkey regulation. This is regulation that hears, sees, and speaks no evil, particularly of banks and other influential stakeholders within the industry. You know, what we've seen is if you create a regulator that ignores bad conduct by banks, you can't have a regulator that suddenly wakes up and spots it when it is perpetrated by a couple of Essex boys renting a serviced office on the edge of the city. You know, it either works or it doesn't, and it's got to work. Supervision must become universal, smart, and worldly wise. You've got to actually do the job. There's got to be a huge ramp up in activity levels, many more dawn raids, Section 166 reports, prosecute financial promotion offences and frauds. Restitution orders must become the norm and not the exception. Now, interestingly, when Dr. Schmulow mentioned this issue of regulatory capture, I noticed the response from Nikhil Rathi could be summarised as, we are not regulatorily captured. Look at how we went after Lloyd's Banking Group. In fact, I think it was Sheldon Mills said it. Look at how we went after Lloyd's Banking Group for what happened in their general assurance division. Well, actually, yes, let's look at it. That covered a period of 2009 to 2020, but I happen to know that there was a whistleblower who blew the whistle about this stuff in 2013. Took them 8 years to act. I also know that the consumer harm that was suffered was many, many times greater than the sum that was paid, I can't remember what the sum was, 13 million or something, voluntarily in redress by the bank. There should have been a restitution order. It should have been for the full value of the loss. So the FCA can't point to, you know, ticking somebody off and say, this is proof that we are not captured. The fact that they only tick them off is the evidence that they're captured. Also, as we've said many times before, go after individuals, claim a few big scalps. Resource limits are often cited by the FCA as a reason why they can't do more. But of course, they determine what the levy is. They have the right to set whatever levy they want. So if they want more people, they can have more people. They've chosen to set it where it is. Scam busters, I think as well, it's not an entirely useless scheme. It notifies people, consumers, how to spot scams and so on, but it could go a lot further. The ads could say, if you spot a scam, let us know. Of course, there's a doubly powerful deterrent there, not only because we hope that the FCA would investigate these leads, but also because scammers would realise that the FCA was actively asking consumers to tip them off, and therefore the risk involved in being a scammer would be massively higher. Accountability and transparency are critical. Here's one of my tweets in which I criticise Richard Lloyd. Here's one of the two non-execs appointed to the FCA board, supposedly to represent consumer interests. I should say no consumer chose him for this role. He was appointed by the business department on the recommendation of the FCA, who is now responsible for holding to account. He is also the person who wrote a supposedly independent report into the Financial Ombudsman Service, which is overseen by the FCA, saying that actually all of the reports that there had been in the media that the organisation was failing were largely untrue. Of course, subsequently, there is a huge backlog built up and the chief executive has had to resign. So I think we need probably some governance that includes some genuine consumer voices. And Dr. Schmulow has spoken about the need for something like an oversight board for financial regulators. And we have a proposal, and there's a link in my presentation, to our plan for a Financial Regulators Supervisory Council. The idea would be to publish an annual effectiveness review for Parliament to see about the regulators. It would commission ad hoc independent reviews. It would be jointly responsible for hiring and firing the FCA's chief executive and chair. It would be solely responsible for hiring the two NEDs that are currently appointed by the business department, the directors of the Financial Ombudsman Service, because the FCA can't be trusted to do it, the Complaints Commissioner, and the Financial Services Consumer Panel, which I note was kind of cited by Nikhil Rathi as part of the kind of a job of listening to consumers that is done by the FCA. But of course, the FCA appoints the members of the Consumer Panel. Some of them, I think, do a very good job, but many of them, I think, have links to the financial services industry, and I wonder how much they actually are able to do to stand up to the FCA. I also think there's an important issue about legal liability here, both for the FCA and the industry. So ever since FSMA was debated in the late 1990s, regulators have been trying to protect the industry from owing a duty of care to consumers and themselves from being legally liable to those who lose money through regulatory failure. We've heard both of those things being spoken about today. Section 29 of the Financial Services Act 2021 has brought the first of these to a head. The new consumer duty is not a duty of care unless there's a private right of action. And the discussion paper misdirects respondents on the legal meaning of a duty of care. It is intrinsically, inherently, by definition, actionable. That's not an optional extra. The consultation on the complaint scheme that commenced in the summer of 2020, results of this have repeatedly been delayed, which seems rather suspicious. Parliament intended the complaint scheme to be unconstrained on quantum or causation of redress, and the FCA's broad exemption from civil liability, in my view, should be reversed. There have been so many cases of regulatory failure. And of course, a genuinely transformative FCA leadership would surely voluntarily and publicly back these changes, because it would be desperate to be accountable to consumers and for the industry as well to want to do the right thing if it mistreats them. These things keep the regulator honest. A duty of care means consumers can bypass a complacent or captured regulator, and legal liability shines a light on costs of regulatory failure. The polluter pays. So just to summarize my proposal for transformation, I think it begins with a fess up and pay up approach to historic cases. It shows that the leadership is serious about change, and it avoids digging an ever deeper hole. I think there has to be an attempt to fix or remove legacy staff, and it's important to be ruthless in this. I think that there's a need to clean up the hiring practices of the FCA and to proactively recruit diverse thinkers and decisive actors into key roles. To treat whistleblowers and evidence, whether it's from whistleblowers or from consumers or others, properly, tackle the cultural problems head on. Ramp up activity levels enormously and shout about it. When you've done something like prosecuting somebody really important or senior or removing permissions, tell people, don't just put it on your website. You know, we need to change behavior by changing people's perceptions. Free monkey regulation for banks infects other sectors. It's unsustainable. The best way to help the industry, in fact, is to give it a ladder to climb down. Be accountable and transparent to consumer representatives, and back legal liability to consumers of the FCA and the industry alike. My message to the FCA, albeit that they've all gone home now, is this: we're willing to work with you. Will you work with us? Thank you very much.
And thank you once again, Mark Bishop. That really was a remarkably coherent set of thoughts. It really was. Can we please all put our hands together to show appreciation for Mark? That obviously took a great deal of time to think through and prepare. I thought that was outstanding. I really do. I really do. As is sometimes traditional in TTF meetings, we've gone way over schedule, but you're all still here because it's such interesting and relevant stuff. Does anybody have anything they are itching to say before we bring this session to a close? Please just raise your hand or wave something at me if you'd like to make a point. David Turnbull, please very, very briefly introduce yourself and make your point, please, David. Then I can see we're going to go to Mark Falcon. David Turnbull, please.
Yes, Andy. I was one of the investors in LCF. On January of 2019, I discovered it was a scam operation. Now, I report this 3 times to Action Fraud. It was not, it was said it was invalid. And yet, on accounts submitted by LCF, there was no actual ingoings and outgoings of various companies. Borrowers were not repaying the loans. And I report this to the FCA, and they do sweet FA about it. Now, I'd like to say to Mark Bishop, a very well put argument. I put this argument in a letter, well, an email for tonight's meeting, but it wasn't taken up. But Mark Bishop has actually handled it very well. Well done, Mark.
Well done, Mr. David Turnbull, and yes, indeed, well done, Mark Bishop. We're going to go from David Turnbull to Mark Falcon, then we're going to go to Nigel Cairns. If I could please invite everybody to be as succinct as you can. Mr. Falcon, thank you.
Hi, Andy. Yeah, very just quick comment on why, in response to Mark's point, the FCA have gone home. It's because they've all got, and this is also sort of an observation to you, Andy. They've all got young families, and so do I. I'm trying to put my kids to bed. And this slot, so this from 6 to 8 is a really bad slot. It's very family unfriendly. So I think you're missing out a lot of people who are sort of have got families and children sort of participating at this time. And it probably reflects the sort of most of the people on the call are either over 60 or under 30. So it just encourages the TTF to sort of look at a more family-friendly, more inclusive time slot for meetings, because I really struggle to join them.
Thank you, Mark. You've made your point very well indeed. Thank you. I have heard what you've said. Thank you very much indeed. From Mark Falcon to Mr. Nigel Cairns.
Well, I would like to say that I think it was very brave of Mr. Rathi to come on this symposium this evening. I think he is genuinely trying to reach out, but I think he's being overly defensive. The particular question that I asked him, I don't think was answered adequately. And I really wouldn't have expected that it would have been in such a format. And I would ask if through you, Andy, we could have a more considered, perhaps, written response to the question, if that's possible.
I can try. I can resubmit all the questions and see if they'd like to reply further. And the other option, of course, Nigel, is to make use of the annual public meeting later on this month.
Yes, I shall be doing so.
Thank you, Nigel. Mark Bishop's raised his hand. Mark.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow on from what Nigel's just said. I actually do think it's very true that it's good of them to have taken part. I accept the point that maybe evenings aren't great for people with young children, you know, and maybe we should consider offering the opportunity to do this at a different time of day and see if they would be prepared to stay the whole time if they did do that. Because we don't yet know how many of our own people would come if we were prepared to do a different time of day. I also think that there is a bit of an issue that in the nicest possible way, they didn't really answer a lot of those questions. There was a lot of motherhood and apple pie statements in there and kind of implied answers. So, for example, you know, are we going to be invited to join the consumer network? I get the feeling we're not, but he didn't want to say so in the call. You know, are we going to, I'm trying to think what other questions there were. You know, he said, I asked the question, are we going to be involved in some way in this transformation program? He said, well, you're asking some questions today and you can ask some questions at the annual public meeting. That's not involvement. You know, involvement would be a two-way dialogue, you know, with the key decision makers about this process. And I don't think they're interested in allowing that. And that concerns me.
Thank you, Mark. And we're going to go to Alex Farley-Winter, who had her hand up a moment ago. Alex, you do still want to speak? Go for it.
Yeah, I was just thinking the example that struck me was Pauline Creasy's question. I admit it was such a detailed question that it slightly flew over my head, but it seemed extremely specific and it seemed to be focused around insolvency. But I don't think that the answer even remotely addressed that area. I may be wrong, and I will obviously re-listen to I recorded the event and I'll re-listen to exactly what they said, what she said, but I just don't think that it actually answered her question at all. I may be wrong.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we're going to bring things to a conclusion. Let's think about the positives here. So, you know, we've managed to organise for the Chief Executive of the FCA and a couple of colleagues to come along, which is good. That's a bit of engagement, a bit of dialogue. Nothing wrong with that. It's a platform we can hopefully build on, and we can remain as forthright in our status as a, inverted commas, critical friend of the FCA as we choose to be. In bringing this session to a close, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, not just those from the FCA, Nikhil Rathi, Ian Searle and Sheldon Mills, but also, of course, Dr. Andy Schmulow and Mark Bishop and everybody else that's had taken the opportunity to get involved and to exchange some thoughts and ideas. Thank you, everybody, for preparing the questions, those that were able to do so. There has been rather a lot of work going on behind the scenes to make tonight happen and for it to work pretty well. I'm pleased with it. We've got a platform we can build on. So thank you all very, very much indeed. Why don't we give ourselves a collective round of applause just for the effort we're putting in to try to make the world a better place. Thank you all very much indeed. Okay, cheers, guys. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks, folks. We'll wrap it up there. Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.